When Emma Rodriguez, a 28-year-old mechanic with permanently grease-stained hands and a shyness that made her nearly invisible, looked up from the engine she was repairing and saw walking into her father's auto shop Marcus Thompson, one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in America, accompanied by an elegant woman with silver hair, she couldn't imagine that the words she was about to speak would forever change the course of her life. Because when the elderly woman approached with a gentle smile and Emma noticed her questioning gaze, her discreet hearing aid, and the way she watched Marcus's mouth when he spoke, something clicked in the mechanic's memory. And what she did next, that simple gesture with her hands that she had learned years ago for reasons no one in the shop knew, left the billionaire completely paralyzed and his mother Grace in tears. Because in that moment, Emma didn't just greet a customer in American Sign Language, but opened a door to a past she herself had buried, to a secret she guarded jealously, and to a future she would never have dared dream possible for a girl born on the wrong side of Brooklyn. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Rodriguez Auto Repair was located in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn, where grey warehouses rose like tired giants against the sky, often covered with smog from the nearby expressway. It was the kind of place where working people brought their rusted Hondas and beat-up Fords, where you haggled over the price of every repair because every dollar counted, where the smell of motor oil mixed with that of coffee from the bodega next door and pizza slices from across the street. Emma Rodriguez had grown up in that shop. Her father, Carlos, had brought her there for the first time when she was barely 6 years old, after her mother had left them for a truck driver heading to Miami, and never came back. The shop had become her home, her refuge, her world. While other girls played with dolls, Emma learned to recognize engine sounds, to distinguish a valve problem from a transmission issue, to dismantle a carburetor with hands that were small but already skilled. Now, at 28, she was one of the best mechanics in Brooklyn, though few knew it because she was so shy she rarely spoke with customers. She let her father handle the business side while she hid under cars, where she felt safe, where her grease-stained hands performed miracles her words never could. She was an ordinary-looking girl, brown hair always pulled back in a messy ponytail, hazel eyes that avoided direct contact, a slender but strong body hidden under oversized work coveralls. Her beauty was the kind that went unnoticed, concealed beneath layers of shyness and insecurity. But there was something no one at the shop knew about Emma, something she had done between ages 16 and 18, when she'd worked part-time as an aide at a nursing home for elderly deaf residents. It had been a job found by chance, through a posting at the employment center, but those 2 years had left an indelible mark on her soul. She had learned ASL, American Sign Language, not out of obligation, but out of love. She'd fallen in love with that silent world so rich in expression, with those people who communicated with a grace and depth that spoken words rarely achieved. She had learned from the residents, from the specialized nurses, from the evening classes she attended for free. And when she finally had to leave that job to dedicate herself full-time to her father's shop that was facing financial difficulties, she carried that knowledge with her like a secret treasure. She didn't talk about it with anyone. It was part of an Emma who existed only in her memories, in that version of herself who for 2 years had the courage to speak, to smile, to be seen. That October morning had started like any other. Emma arrived at the shop at 7, made coffee for her father, checked the cars scheduled for the day. There were 3 vehicles to repair, all from regular neighborhood customers. Nothing special, nothing complicated. She'd started with an old Nissan Altima that had cooling system problems. It was past 10 when she heard the rumble of an engine that didn't belong to the neighborhood. It was a powerful, clean, expensive sound. She looked up from under the Nissan's hood and saw entering the shop's lot a black, gleaming Tesla Model S, the kind of car worth more than the entire building that housed Rodriguez Auto Repair. From the driver's seat stepped a chauffeur in uniform who opened the rear door. First out was a man in his early 40s, tall, with perfectly styled brown hair, dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than 6 months of Emma's salary. He had that type of sharp handsomeness that comes from lucky genetics and obsessive attention to fitness. A square jaw, piercing blue eyes, the bearing of someone used to being in charge. Behind him stepped an older woman, perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled into an elegant bun, wearing a pearl grey suit and a pearl necklace that gleamed in the morning light. She had an aristocratic air, but softened by a genuine smile. Emma immediately recognized the man because it was impossible not to. Marcus Thompson was one of the most recognizable faces in America, appearing frequently in business magazines and television programs. At 42, he had built an empire in the tech sector, starting from a small startup to owning one of the most important software companies in the United States. His net worth was estimated at around $3 billion. He collected luxury cars, lived in a penthouse in Manhattan that had been photographed by Architectural Digest, rubbed shoulders with senators and movie stars. Her father, Carlos, came out immediately from his office, wiping his hands on a dirty rag, his expression confused and slightly intimidated. The presence of people like Marcus Thompson in a shop like theirs was as surreal as the appearance of a unicorn. Emma watched the scene from a distance, hidden as always, her hands nervously gripping the wrench. She saw the chauffeur speaking with her father, explaining there was a mechanical problem with the Tesla, that they were returning from the Thompson country estate in upstate New York when they'd noticed a strange noise from the motor. They'd stopped at the first shop they found, which happened to be theirs. They'd already called their regular Manhattan dealership, but it would take hours before a tow truck arrived, and Marcus had an important meeting that afternoon. Carlos nodded, clearly nervous, called Emma with a wave of his hand. She approached slowly, eyes down, uselessly cleaning her hands on coveralls that were already completely dirty. Her father quickly explained the situation, asked her to take a quick look at the engine, to see if it was something she could fix on the spot. Emma approached the Tesla with the reverent respect of someone touching a work of art. She opened the hood, and for a few minutes immersed herself in the work, forgetting the outside world. She identified the problem almost immediately. A loose alternator belt that had started rubbing against other components. Nothing serious, easily fixable in half an hour. It was while checking other aspects of the motor that she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found herself face to face with Grace Thompson, Marcus's mother. The woman looked at her with gentle curiosity, then pointed at the engine and said something Emma didn't understand at first, because she spoke with the slight distortion typical of those with hearing problems. In that moment, Emma noticed the details, the discreet but visible hearing aid in Grace's right ear, the way the woman positioned herself to read lips, how her eyes moved between Emma's face and the engine, trying to understand through visual context. Something clicked in Emma's mind, a memory of her years at the nursing home, of the people she'd learned to love, of the silent conversations she'd learned to treasure. Without thinking too much, without calculating consequences, Emma set down the wrench and raised her hands. With slow and clear movements, she signed in ASL, a formal and respectful greeting, then explained there was a minor problem with the belt, that she could repair it quickly, that the car would be perfect. Her hands moved with a grace her shy body rarely showed, each sign precise and full of expression. The silence that followed was total and absolute. The chauffeur had frozen. Carlos had his mouth open in visible shock, but it was Marcus Thompson who seemed most affected. His blue eyes had widened, his face had lost every trace of its usual controlled expression and filled with pure, unexpected emotion. And Grace, the mother who in recent years had progressively lost her hearing due to a degenerative disease, who lived in a world of silence, interrupted only by hearing aids that weren't always effective, began to cry. Not sobs, but silent tears that ran down her aristocratic face as her hands rose to respond to Emma in perfect ASL, thanking her for the kindness, for seeing her as a person and not as a problem to solve. Marcus had never seen his mother cry like this. Grace Thompson had faced 10 years of progressive hearing loss with stoicism, had abandoned the ballet she loved, had endured everything with elegance. But now she cried looking at a mechanic in a Brooklyn shop, and Marcus immediately understood why. This shy girl communicated with his mother with a fluidity he rarely saw even in the professionals he paid thousands of dollars. He'd tried to learn ASL, but his work commitments allowed only sporadic lessons. His mother lived in a bubble of golden isolation, surrounded by people who spoke to her like a child instead of the former university literature professor she was. Emma explained the motor problem to Grace with fluid signs, rich expressions, genuine attention. Grace responded with that intellectual vivacity that had seemed extinguished for years and now returned to shine. Carlos watched without understanding. His daughter had never mentioned knowing ASL. Where had she learned? Why had she never talked about it? Emma returned to the motor, worked efficiently, replaced the belt, checked the system. Exactly half an hour. When she closed the hood, she found Marcus watching her with an intensity that made her blush. Not arrogance, but genuine curiosity and respect. Through Grace as interpreter, Marcus asked where she'd learned ASL. Emma shyly explained about the nursing home, the 2 years there, how the experience had changed her. Grace translated, adding how rare it was to find people who communicated with such naturalness. Emma explained she had no official certifications, that she was too shy to be a professional interpreter. She preferred motors to people.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
When it came time to pay, Marcus paid 10 times the ridiculously low amount Carlos had asked. Then he returned to Emma and gave her his business card, if she ever needed anything, an opportunity to call him. When the Tesla disappeared into Brooklyn traffic, Emma looked at the card. She pocketed it, thinking she'd probably never use it, that it was just courtesy from a rich man. She couldn't know how wrong she was. 2 weeks passed. Emma repaired cars, avoided her father's questions about ASL, hid under hoods. Marcus's card stayed in her pocket. She'd pulled it out dozens of times but never called. What would she say? It was ridiculous. One November evening, as she closed the shop, she saw a female figure approaching from the shadows. It was Grace Thompson, alone, elegant and out of place in Red Hook at night, with a desperate expression. Her hands moved frantically. She'd gotten lost after a cultural event in the neighborhood. The chauffeur had had an accident. She couldn't call a cab, couldn't hear well on the phone. She was alone, in the dark, scared. Emma didn't think twice. She brought her to the office, made her tea, called Marcus. 20 minutes later, he arrived like fury, hair disheveled, tie loosened. He hugged his mother with force, then turned to Emma with shining eyes. He thanked her with a broken voice. He couldn't imagine what could have happened if his mother had been left alone there, unable to ask for help. And this time, the offer wasn't empty courtesy. He offered her a job at his cultural center, managing accessibility for deaf people, organizing events with ASL, building bridges between worlds. The salary was triple the shop. Emma was speechless. It was an impossible dream for a Brooklyn mechanic, but she was afraid to leave her father, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of failing. Grace took her calloused hands between her perfectly manicured ones. She signed something that broke every defense. Emma had a gift, seeing people instead of their limits. Wasting it among wrenches was a sin against the world. Emma cried for the first time in years, and through tears said she'd think about it. Her father was surprisingly understanding. When Emma told him about the offer, Carlos looked at her silently, then smiled with sweet sadness and told her to go. He said he'd always known his daughter was destined for greater things than repairing old Hondas, that it was time she stopped hiding among motors and started truly living. He cried when he said this, and Emma understood how much love was in letting her go. Her first day at the Thompson Cultural Centre was terrifying. The building was a renovated warehouse in Chelsea, all glass and steel, with high-tech conference rooms and a staff of brilliant young people who spoke languages she didn't know and of projects that seemed from another planet. She felt like a fish out of water. A mechanic who still smelled of the shop despite the new blazer she'd bought for the occasion. But Marcus was patient. He gave her time to adapt, assigned her a mentor, let her build the program her way. And Emma, slowly, began to blossom. She organized the first event with complete ASL interpretation, a conference on tech innovation. She invited New York's deaf community, created partnerships with associations, built something bigger than herself. Months passed, and the program became a success. Media started talking about it. Other companies called for consultations. Emma was interviewed by newspapers and TV programs, and though she died of fear every time, she did it because she knew it was important that she was giving voice to those who had none. And throughout all this, something unspoken grew between her and Marcus. Stolen glances during meetings, conversations that extended beyond necessary, moments when their hands brushed accidentally and neither pulled away. Grace saw it and smiled with that wisdom of mothers who can read hearts. It was during an evening event, an art exhibition with ASL performances, that everything changed. Emma had organized everything perfectly. The event was a triumph. At the end, as guests left and lights dimmed, Marcus found her alone in the empty hall, sitting on a chair with the expression of someone who can't believe what she'd built. He sat beside her in silence, then slowly began to speak. He said that in the months since meeting her, his life had changed in ways he couldn't explain. He said she taught him to see the world differently, to understand that true wealth wasn't the billions in the bank, but the ability to authentically connect with others. He said his mother had never smiled as much as since Emma entered their lives. And then he said something that made Emma's heart stop. He said he'd fallen in love with her. Emma couldn't respond with words. Instead, she did what she knew best. Her hands rose, trembling but determined, and in ASL, in the language that had brought these two impossible worlds together, she said she'd fallen in love with him too. The kiss that followed was sweet and inevitable as dawn after the longest night. The weeks that followed were a mixture of happiness and complexity. The relationship between Emma and Marcus wasn't simple to navigate. They came from such different worlds that sometimes it seemed they spoke different languages, and not just metaphorically. She loved walks in Red Hook street markets. He preferred Manhattan's starred restaurants. She found peace in quiet afternoons. He lived in a constant vortex of calls and meetings. But they found their balance. Marcus learned to appreciate the simplicity Emma brought to his complicated life. She learned that wealth didn't necessarily mean superficiality, that you could be successful and remain human. They spent evenings at his penthouse, her teaching him ASL, while Grace smiled proudly. Him telling her about his dreams for the company, projects he wanted to realize. But it wasn't all roses. The tabloid press discovered the relationship, and the headlines were cruel. They called her a gold digger, a simple mechanic who'd used sign language to seduce a billionaire. Online comments were even worse. Emma cried, reading the terrible things people wrote, feeling that maybe they were right, that maybe she didn't belong in that world. It was Grace who saved her. In a long, silent conversation in the penthouse garden, Marcus's mother told her that people's meanness is always proportional to their envy, that Emma had done nothing wrong but be herself. She said her son was happier than he'd ever been, that he'd rediscovered the humanity years of success had stolen from him, and then she told her something that changed Emma's perspective forever. She recounted that she herself, Grace, came from a working-class family in Queens, that she'd met Marcus's father when she worked as a waitress in a restaurant where he dined. Everyone said it wouldn't last, that class differences were too great, but they'd been happily married for 45 years, until his death. True love, Grace signed with wise hands, knows no social classes. It knows only hearts that recognize each other. 1 year after that chance meeting at the Red Hook shop, Emma stood on a stage at the Thompson Cultural Center before 200 people, half deaf, half hearing. She was presenting the new accessibility program they'd developed, a model that other companies across America were starting to copy. She spoke with a confidence that would have surprised the shy girl hidden under motors a year ago. Her hands moved fluidly between signs and gestures. Her voice was clear and passionate. Marcus watched from the front row with pride shining in his eyes, Grace beside him with tears of joy. Her father Carlos was there in the back row, wearing his only good suit, eyes glistening. The shop now had a new partner, a young neighborhood mechanic Marcus had helped train, and was doing better than ever. Carlos could finally enjoy a quieter life, knowing his daughter had found her path. At the end of the presentation, as applause filled the hall, Marcus came on stage. He took the microphone and said he had a special announcement. Then, with awkward but sincere movements, he began signing in ASL. He'd studied secretly for months for this moment. He asked Emma to marry him, not with words but with signs, in the language that had united their lives. The room exploded in moved silence, everyone holding their breath. Emma looked at the man before her, the billionaire who'd learned to speak with his hands for love, the mother crying happily, the father smiling proudly. She thought of the impossible journey that had brought her from a Brooklyn shop to that moment, of the shy girl who dared make a simple gesture of kindness and changed everything. Her hands rose, and in the most beautiful language she knew, in the language of the heart that transcends all barriers, she said yes. The kiss that followed was applauded by 200 people who, deaf or hearing, all understood the universal language of true love. 2 years later, Emma and Marcus were married, living between his penthouse and an apartment they'd bought in Red Hook, because Emma never wanted to forget where she came from. She continued directing the accessibility program, now expanded nationwide. He transformed his company, integrating inclusivity into every aspect of the business. Grace lived with them half the time, the other half traveling across America, giving talks on living with deafness, having become an important voice in the community. Carlos had sold the shop for a generous sum that Marcus ensured was fair, and now spent afternoons in his garden, finally at peace. And sometimes, when life became too complicated, too full of commitments and responsibilities, Emma went down to the garage of the penthouse where Marcus kept his collection of vintage cars. She'd lie under an old Mustang, get her hands dirty with grease, and for an hour return to being that girl who found comfort in the silent language of engines. But now she knew that true comfort wasn't in hiding, but in showing herself, in using her hands not just to repair machines, but to build bridges between different worlds, in understanding that the simplest kindness, a greeting made with hands to a woman who couldn't hear, could change not only your life, but that of everyone around you. Because sometimes destiny doesn't knock at the door. Sometimes it enters a run-down shop with a broken Tesla and a mother who needs to be seen. And if you have the courage to respond with your heart instead of fear, it can take you to places you never dared dream. If this story made you believe that kindness still has the power to change lives, leave a little heart below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this that talk about real people with real hearts in a world that too often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a little thank you through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Emma's gesture when she raised those hands and changed everything. Because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonist of this story.